Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm a social studies educator, historian, and host of this, the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. I'm also an avid collector of popular culture artifacts. I love what I find at thrift store outlets, garage sale leftovers, and what I spot just making my way around the built world. I enjoy sorting through boxes of free books and magazines, not to mention online collections like Internet Archive and, of course, the Library of Congress. But you don't need to spend your time digging through bins or following online rabbit holes to get a look into the past. The movies and TV we watch, the books we read, and the games we play are all documents of the past. So is fashion, food, music, toys, even the roads we travel on and the places we live and work in. Everything is a primary source. This is turned into a very fascinating conversation. This is just the work that you're doing. I love the way you're articulating it and comparing it to other time periods and everything. And it's ways that it's different from just what's in pop culture now is great. I know I said something about let's talk about 2001: A Space Odyssey, but I think that this podcast has turned out wonderful just talking about kind of the history of AI. But if you'd like, we can spend just a few minutes just touching on it, I suppose, because what I like to do with these conversations is use them as starting points for other conversations. So people would be able to hear our breaking down of this film and at least aspects of it, and then they can add their ideas to it on everything-history.com. So, which is my website. So the question I was thinking of, and I think it segues or connects perfectly to what we've been just talking about, and that is the why was this made? So this movie was written and created simultaneously with the story. So the text version of 2001: A Space Odyssey and the film version came out in 1968. 1968, what's happening
What
in, I
happened?
mean, it's an easy answer, right? What's happening in space exploration
Mhm.
at that time that might have inspired this movie?
Well, amazing thing happened, not just in 68, of course, in 69, but in the previous decade. So let's roll back to 1956 in a movie called Forbidden Planet, which is probably up with 2001, one of my very favorite science fiction stories of all time. Forbidden Planet takes place hundreds of years into the future. And at the beginning of it, there is a little narrative of the history of humans and going into space. And it confidently stated that human beings first landed on the moon in the last part of the 21st century. What
Hmm.
a miss.
Right. That's
Humans landed on
150
the
years.
moon 13 years later. And what happened? How could they be so wrong? Well, they could be so wrong because of the phenomenon of the Apollo program. I would generally argue that as an engineering achievement, standalone, it's up there with the Egyptian pyramids, which took hundreds and hundreds of years to make, but the Apollo program did it in a decade. That was astonishing. Now, but it recalibrated people's minds about how fast this technology was moving. And humans, one of the science fiction writers, I forgot which, was it Heinlein or maybe it was Clarke or Asimov, had made, probably Asimov, had made the comment that human beings are always have been historians and futurists have always overestimated the speed of social progress and underestimated the speed of technical progress. And here was the poster child for underestimating how fast technical progress was. But so 2001 is a straight line interpolation from the beginning of the Apollo program to 1969 to 2001. Straight line interpolation.
Mhm.
Uh, if we had continued to make progress in space technology uh, at the same rate as the Apollo program done, we would have had huge moon bases on the moon in 2001. I don't think there's really any doubt about that. So that's what happened. But it
Yeah.
didn't happen, did it?
No,
After,
it
after the last Apollo, after we did Apollo 11, the will and the focus and the vision evaporated.
because you need a public, or in this case popular, interest in it, to really continue to boost it. And once man lands on the moon and we have um that imagery, that great success, that you're right, future Apollo missions, because there were a few after that, really didn't have the appeal. It wasn't till
Well,
13, which, they famously uh actually didn't air what their TV spot, when they were, because they're just like, people are tired of the space program now that they've landed on the moon. It's become, the
well,
public interest isn't there.
I don't want to necessarily tread into areas where I might spark vehement disagreement with people necessarily, but of course I have a theory, I have a model for what happened and why that happened. And my model is that Apollo had been sold to the general public, by the government as, being like Columbus. It was the next great wave of exploration into the universe, and people
Mhm.
were fired up about that. And, the people who worked on the program were fired up about it. It was the best example ever of what I consider vision-driven engineering, in which everybody on that team, and there were huge. I mean, I think there were 1,000 different contractors, working on the program, plus the NASA employees, and during the breakneck pace of it. It didn't matter if you were a government employee, which company you worked for. You were all working to achieve this wonderful vision, which was as important as the discovery of the new world. And everybody said, what can I do to push this forward? And if I can help you, I'll help you. If you can help me, I'll ask for help. And everybody kind of sorted themselves out, and it was a miracle of vision-driven engineering. But it didn't turn out really to be a commitment to opening a new world. It was driven by the need to demonstrate the United States technical superiority to the Russians by being
Right.
on the moon. And once they did that, the last couple of missions were just rock collecting expeditions. And people's enthusiasm for spending that money on rock collecting wasn't there because there was nobody articulating what comes next. There were, by the way, but the government had the monopoly on space technology, and it wasn't interested anymore. So people like Gerald O'Neill or Arthur Clarke with his vision, they didn't go anywhere. So it took a long time. It just stopped.
Mhm.
And NASA became a very different organization, as I found when I went to work at Goddard Space Flight Center in 1982, 83. It wasn't the same organization it had been in the 60s at all. It was like any other government bureaucracy. Lots of good people,
Yeah.
but the people in it themselves still had stars in their eyes. But they were very frustrated because big bureaucracies don't do great engineering projects. Except unless you're building the pyramids and you've got 2 centuries to do it. I think ancient Egypt had a bureaucracy and they were very stable and not in a hurry. But that was a static culture. It's exactly the opposite of the culture we have now, which continues to go technology at a breakneck pace. But there was this dead stop basically on space exploration until now, really.
Yeah. it it matches up very nicely, not just with individuals, but the spirit of the 60s. I think, unfortunately, the imagery that we get, especially from the late 60s, of social unrest and things of that nature, I think overshadows the technological advances that were happening throughout that decade. And that's what excited people. It was motivated by vision and then actually did take place and was just moving things along at this amazing speed. You mentioned about, creating new worlds. That was something that, and comparing it to Columbus, people. like to argue about that and say, well, he didn't discover a new world; it was already there. I'm like, no, no, but in a way, a new world was created because it was two parts of the globe that didn't understand each other, never had a real connection. It's almost like the overlapping of a Venn diagram, right? That when two things that were independently developing from one another suddenly have contact with each other, what results is a new world, right? It's and everybody's model, like you were mentioning before, comes out of that too. And so the same kind of thing was on the horizon in that in between period of the late 50s and then into the 60s of we can do our part, see that thing up there that's been, that moon that we've been looking at for our entire existence. If we could start with that anyway, that would create a whole new perspective. And
Mhm.
I mean, that's where this movie goes. I mean, there's, I think the image that I'm have on our screen now is first of all wonderful. I love the aesthetics of 2001 because it does what a good science fiction movie set in the future does, where it integrates the familiar. In this case, we have a sign for Hilton Hotel,
Yes.
um, with the new, right? And so it doesn't look so impossible. And in fact, I remember 2001, the actual time period. I think there was a lot of people intentionally going for this futuristic aesthetic. They wanted to have the white walls and the bright colors, but kind of not everywhere, very simplified, organized look to
But you
everything.
can still see the roots there in mid-century modern, of mid-20th century modern. You can see a lot of the shapes sort of come because it was only 1968, you still
Yeah.
were mid-century, but that was, the modern view ahead. And so very much the modern thing. But think about, you said the aesthetic here. Think about the psychological impact of what you're looking at. And go back to Columbus. Okay. Yes. Found out there was another world over there. I mean, a world, a whole continent, and that human beings could get there. They didn't all go at once. 1492 to the first, major colonies took a while, but eventually, what it did to the cultural psyche of the people in the European continent, at a certain point, it clicked in their heads that you could go there, and that going there might be the solution to the problems that you had where you were.
Hmm.
And that changed the entire course of human history and the way human beings think. And what you have today isn't necessarily what you will always have because you can maybe go over there and try something new. So Apollo showed us a glimpse of the technology. We actually can get to the moon. It's not 100 years in the future. We just did it. This is showing us only 40 years in the future, and people are there. You can go there. You can go, it's a hotel. You can get on a Pan Am and you can go into space. So it's open. The new world, we've achieved it. We can go there. We can build factories. We can build colonies on the moon. All bets are off from the old world. If we're not limited to one world, and with a new world, the the liberation of human imagination has no bounds. So this was a wonderful. I see, and perfectly captures the vision that Apollo was based on, and
Hmm.
why we did Apollo. Why those engineers who built it. They had this vision. They thought they were one with Columbus. They believed it, and so did the American public. And this was a perfect making that vision real. So it's um, it's still, I think, wedged in our psyche, today. But
And another component of late 1960s as you enter into the 70s on Earth is that of identity politics. And one of the things that, one of the groups, one of the many groups that emerged would be Native Americans, who would, of course, point to Columbus 1492 is the beginning of the end for their the many nations that made up North and South America. Um, the moon, on the other hand, is to my knowledge uninhabited, and so therefore almost like a that also matches the tenor of the 1960s of colonialism equals a lot of negativity, but if we colonize a place that nobody lives, that's not bad, right? Like that could, we're not gonna, it's kind of like the Azores in the Atlantic that was uninhabited when the Portuguese arrived there in the mid 15th century, and so they didn't have that moral or ethical weight to conquering, or even if it was unintentionally spreading disease and things like that. The moon, hey, blank slate, let's do it, let's go up there, and we don't have to have any kind of uh hangups about the moon. But this movie also kind of has a bit of a cautionary tale as well, because they put a lot of stock into the artificial intelligence. So it's like a good mix of it. It's like, here's the vision, here's what could happen because of what's happening right now with the space program with Apollo, but this could be the negative side of it.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I think it was very, very well done in a way. Yeah, it was very positive. I thought a very positive movie about human's future, and leave off the whatever the weird ending and the monolith builders. I mean that's a good yarn, but it's really to me not fundamental for the importance of the movie in terms of the vision it gave us of the future and humanity's migration, uh, colonization, if you will, into space. Um, I mean, you're right, though. I don't know that in any politics it wasn't even a term in those days, and I don't know that uh, uh, the fundamental aspect of human nature, which means they will migrate, they will move, they will go from place to place. And of course, I guess if there's already people in that place, you call that colonization. And that can be, you know, a very unhappy experience. When the migrating, uh, when the mixing cultures are unevenly balanced, it's messy
Right.
in a way. But you're right. But human beings, it's in our blood, right? And I see something tremendously positive about that. In terms of how we see ourselves as human beings.
Did you know that Everything is a Primary Source now has a series of short videos which, like the podcast, teach social studies concepts through popular culture? Check out the Everything is a Primary Source Finds playlist on YouTube for quick overviews of the artifacts I uncover at Goodwill outlets, pick up from the side of the road, or resurrect from my youth, because I don't throw much out. These are great class starters for teachers, and because each clip ends with citation, they're great for students too. Furthermore, EPS Finds episodes become the starting point for the open source Everything's a Primary Source project, which encourages you and your students, if you have some, to add to the conversation. Or you can just enjoy them as you would any one of the other billions of clips on YouTube. It's up to you. Go to YouTube and become a subscriber to the Everything's a Primary Source channel today. Now, back to the conversation.
So why is it throughout history, every society that you want to study is basically organized like a pyramid, like ancient Egypt? Many of them use pyramids as their favorite source of architecture, but their societies were pyramids as well, with a
Mm.
small number of people, maybe one person at the top, the god king, but then a small number of people under them, him or they, or a small number of aristocrats, and then a wider group of, you know, uh, whatever. Until at the bottom, you get the great majority of people who are basically told what to do by the people at the top. That was the human condition, and There were worse and better ones, more pure metal or less pure metal. Um, during the Greek and Roman period, there was backed off that somewhat, but still, and even into late modern European history, how many people really call the shots in, say, Germany? 4% of the population, in 2%, England maybe 4%. So that was the way humans did. They sorted themselves by status and class, and the people at the top told everybody else what to do. And the people at the bottom were like, just raw materials,
Mhm.
serfs. So it was taken for granted that that was the way the world works. But all of a sudden, there was North America sitting over there, and people could get together enough money to buy something which is barely seaworthy, and they could go over there and they could survive and set up shop. And they didn't have any government. My family tradition is, my mother's side of the family, three brothers came over from Bristol, England, before Jamestown, and settled on, set up shop on the Maryland Eastern Shore.
Mhm.
You know, uh, but you could do that, and the amount of these early expeditions were not huge national investments after a while, and people started coming, and then it was a purposeful thing, and they had these vast resources and they spread out, and they created a culture, and they created a thriving, expanding human culture based on the European model, but really without government. They didn't have a huge government. They didn't have classes, really. There was no real class. I mean, once we started population increasing, the people who came over there didn't were aristocrats by and large. We didn't have classes.
Yeah.
So,
Particularly in the 17th century. I mean, it was just kind of sorted out. Like you might have titles.
yeah,
A lot of
uh,
people came here to get that title, or they gave it to themselves. But up here in northern New England, um, actually I teach a class about Seacoast New Hampshire history, and we were doing 17th century, and one of the people that we were looking at, it mentioned like three occupations that the person did because there simply wasn't enough people to
right.
divvy up the job. So it was like you might also be the judge and a tailor, and that concept of like civic duty means something totally different in America than it does in Europe
So,
because
so
of
I,
it.
I said the importance of human beings adapting to what will allow them to survive and succeed. Well, cooperation was the order of the day. There was no classes. There was no limit to how far you could go up in there in that society, because we do like to have status, but you know, uh, but there was not really government. Yeah, there was a colonial governor maybe, but there was essentially no taxes. Remember, we had fought a revolution with the mother company because they put a 7% tax on tea. We thought that was intolerable. So
Yeah.
what's the thing? So, but here we have a society which is bucking the norm for all of recorded history. It's not being controlled by a small minority at the top. In fact, there's essentially no government. So what happens? So that was a completely, that was the uh, the practical proof that the notion of human individual rights articulated by Locke and Hobbes actually worked in practice. Here was the petri jar, and it was thriving. So then, even in America, as people tend to, accumulate wealth and status, and want to have more government, if you didn't like what the local government was doing and didn't feel like you could vote and really make your needs, you just moved further west. And so, as long as you could move further west, the notion, or I would say the myth, that people will run amok without a heavy government telling them that the vast majority, in other words, going back to the pyramid, the whatever they used to sell the pyramid on, divine mighty kings or whatever, there's always something, people laughed at that. Clearly, we don't need that. And that persisted until what happened? Until you could move further west.
Right. The Proclamation of 1763 is really that tipping point, which starts a revolution era because that was from the top down, telling can't go any further than the
Right. Well,
Appalachians, and that that really started people talking amongst themselves about, well, if we can fight against our colonial enemies ourselves, why not govern ourselves?
Yeah,
And
right. So, and they will move farther west,
right,
and even
regardless.
and it was unstoppable. In fact, you're probably aware that the United States government. We talked about the indigenous people, and the United States government continually would sign treaties with them, often with at least according to Tocqueville, with honestly hoping they would be able to keep the treaty, but they couldn't keep it from moving west. They passed a law. People, I don't care about that. They just moved west
Yeah,
until you got to California, and then the whole thing stopped. And I think it's so interesting when you think about that. The narrative, oh, that we need government, we need more government, started when California was settled with the myth of the Wild West. That lawless meant rampant crime, but lawlessness, there wasn't much law out there that was true. There was no government, but there wasn't rampant crime. But that was sold through yellow journalism that it was crazy. You'd have to have government because otherwise people don't behave. Well, think
yeah,
about the crime issue. Was so not what was the norm in the old west that the criminals that were out there we still remember their names. you know. So so what is 2001? It's saying you're going to be able to go. You're going to be able to get out. You're going to be able to
mhm,
do what you want to do. You're going to be able to establish your own way of living for whatever reason you want to do it, just like we had in this country. And that's what excites me so much is the myth of the pyramid, that we have to have a pyramidal society is it is shown to be fallacious. But look,
yeah,
people living together, they don't have a huge pyramidal giant government with their thumb on everything they do, telling them how to think, talking them how to behave, you know, whatever they want to do. You don't need that. They're living in harmony. They're prosperous. They're reasonably safe. They have security. They have unlimited opportunity. That's how human beings will choose that if they have the choice.
mhm.
If they don't have that choice, then they'll adapt to whatever regime that they have to adapt to. So yes, I think 2001 um, and what it represents is as a important vision today as it was in 1968, when it seemed like not only a far-fetched vision, but one that was on the right before our fingertips. We all believed it.
I'm I'm so excited that I love how this conversation went from all the places that it did, and that we spent so much time comparing and contrasting, the particularly the English colonization of America and what that produced, and that line all the way to then. I mean, if we wanted to go further, and with that line of thinking of California being the first example of, federal authority in particular trying to, my understanding is that part of the reason for Hollywood becoming the industry home for movies was because you couldn't get further away from copyright laws for storytelling and technology than Southern California compared to the patent office in Washington. And so the enforcement of those kinds of things was so wonky. So then we get to 1968, kind of a low time for Hollywood. They weren't really the golden age had been over for a while by 1968. TV had taken over. But the decision to tell this story, 2001: A Space Odyssey, through text and film at the same time shows that it wasn't dead, that it was still very much, because those are really the only two forms of media that you could put such a huge story into. You couldn't tell it on
Yeah.
TV. It would just be lost in space. You
Yes.
couldn't tell it in music. That would be ridiculous. You could only tell it through what the art form of film and through text. And they filmed it not in Hollywood, but in Great Britain. So all comes back around.
Mhm.
The very island that Thomas Paine, referred to as how ridiculous it is an island can control a continent. And he advocated in his book, his pamphlet, Common Sense, which is the first words that we started with on our conversation today, with
Mhm.
advocating for a republic so that the ordinary people could go about their lives, invent things, do their daily chores, and not have to be concerned every waking moment with governing. So look at how all these things tied together so wonderfully. Brian, I can't
Oh,
thank you enough for joining me for this wonderful conversation. And I have a feeling it's going to actually turn into several podcasts, not just one.
well, there is a lot more to talk about.
There is. And before we break though, how can people uh, learn more about your company?
Oh, well, newsapiens.com.
That's an easy one to remember. It's not
Spell sapiens. I'm not a good speller, so I have to struggle. But newsapiens, one word, .com or .ai. They both work. And there's quite a bit of information there. I also have, I haven't done any much with it, although we do have, I have a website that a personal website, but called Forward to the Future. That's, and Forward to the
okay.
Future's got some podcasts that we do, the Sapiens podcast. We talk about New Sapiens and quite a few other articles. Um, it mostly now dominated by AI. Originally started out just to be more futurism,
Mhm.
but some of my thoughts about things are available there. And we have a
Oh,
YouTube channel. New Sapiens has a YouTube channel.
excellent. Well, I mean, futurism and AI have kind of melded into one thing now, so that's
Well, so
perfectly,
yeah, well, what they call AI, you know,
yeah. But
but we're still doing it. We're still using the word the way it used to. The way it the common usage of the term artificial intelligence that it's still we in spite of its coming to mean in my opinion something that's quite bizarre in many ways with like LLMs, but the meaning of yes, machines that would truly understand what you mean and have common sense about the world and have knowledge and have an internal model just like humans do. That's the sense that we still mean AI at New Sapiens. That's what we're building.
that's fascinating. And I'm so glad that we had this conversation because it really clarifies and honestly comforts me a lot more about the future of artificial intelligence. And
Oh,
that's
good.
a good
Good.
thing.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. You know, a lot of our investors have said the same thing. I mean, we have one investor who came in and was an ordinary person, a real estate agent on the West Coast who made a nice investment in the company. He said, "I used to be really depressed about the future. You know, all this stuff out there with these young people getting addicted, and technology seems dark, and these algorithms and treating people like statistics and determining who gets a job." And he's really depressed, but he says, "Your company gives me hope that it's not going to turn out that way, that there's a brighter future, and that there's a kind of AI that isn't dark and strange and weird and problematical and
Mm.
doesn't hallucinate."
No, it's an important message to send because I think too often we get just a little snippets of like the other day there was a video coming out of China of a AI robot getting aggressive with people in a crowd. And I mean that's the kind of thing where people are like, well, that's it. Let's shut it down. No more of this AI stuff. This is proof that you need, but it's like, well, there is in anything, in any discipline, there's those who take shortcuts and don't
Well,
really
that's
care
the
what they're
thing about
doing.
the
And
shortcut.
then,
That's the shortcut. I mean, I really think that LLMs are seen as a shortcut to real artificial and general intelligence, but they are a shortcut. They're an illusion. I often think that the idea that LLMs and those machine learning algorithms are really going to get us to true intelligence in machines is like the illusion of stage magic. You go into the theater and the magician puts the lady in the box and waves a magic wand, and voila, she's gone. And compelling, everybody gasps. And how did they do that? And you can get better and better at that illusion. but you're not getting closer to inventing teleportation.
Right.
Okay. So you want an LLM, a robot, humanoid robot in your kitchen handling sharp knives that hallucinates, half the time. In fact, everything they do is an hallucination. It's only that once in a while or some of the time, there's a match to what a human would say is true. But they don't know anything is true. They don't know anything.
Right.
So I don't want that in my kitchen. So
Well, I'll tell you, the listeners of this podcast now know a lot more thanks to our conversation. I really appreciate you joining me for this, Bryant Cruse and New Sapiens, and this has been wonderful. And thank you, all listeners, for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything, including artificial intellect and 2001: A Space Odyssey, is a primary source. We'll talk to you next time. Popular culture, by definition, connects and unites us, and proves that people of different backgrounds, in fact, have a lot in common with one another. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, at least in part, for that reason. If it connects with you and you'd like to add to it, or any of the podcast episodes, just visit everything-history.com and search for the Everything as a Primary Source project, which can be found in the classroom section of the website. We'd love to hear what you have to say. Be sure to rate and share this podcast wherever you are listening to it now, and follow Everything as a Primary Source on social media, including YouTube and especially Instagram. Thank you for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.